"Take it off," the judge said, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade honed on authority rather than respect. "This is a court of law, not a stage for old war stories." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, echoing off the polished wood and high ceilings of courtroom 3B, where every seat was filled and every eye had turned toward the man in the wheelchair at the center of it all. Robert Hayes sat motionless, his frame thin but upright, a dark suit pressed with care despite its age, the faint sheen of a single medal resting against his chest, its ribbon faded, its metal worn smooth by time. He didn't look at the judge, didn't react to the murmurs rippling through the room. His gaze stayed forward, steady, as if the world around him had narrowed to something only he could see. Judge Arthur Whitmore leaned forward from his bench, impatience tightening his jaw, the gavel still in his hand as though he might use it again just to remind everyone who held control. "I will not repeat myself," he continued, louder now, his tone carrying the practiced weight of command. "Remove it or be held in contempt." A few scattered chuckles rose from the back, quickly stifled, while others shifted uncomfortably, sensing something wasn't right but unable to name it. Robert's hand moved, slow and deliberate, not to remove the medal, but to rest lightly over it, his fingers brushing the ribbon with a familiarity that spoke of years, not moments, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, but carried across the room with a quiet force that made even the bailiff pause. "This medal doesn't come off." The simplicity of the sentence seemed to unsettle more than defiance ever could. Whitmore's eyes narrowed, interpreting silence as challenge, restraint as disrespect. "You think that gives you special privilege," he snapped, rising slightly from his seat. "You think this courtroom bends to sentiment." He stepped down from the bench, an unusual breach of formality, his polished shoes striking the floor with controlled irritation as he approached. The room held its breath, the distance between authority and dignity shrinking with every step. "I've seen plenty of decorations," the judge said, gesturing dismissively, "props, souvenirs, things men hold on to when they've got nothing else left." He reached out, not forcefully, but with a casual disregard that felt heavier than any command, his fingers brushing the edge of the metal as if testing its worth, and in that small, careless motion, something shifted, not in the room, but in the man who wore it. Robert's eyes didn't flare with anger, didn't harden with defiance, they deepened, like a horizon darkening before a storm no one else could see. For a fraction of a second, the courtroom seemed to fade behind them, the hum of fluorescent lights replaced by a silence that carried weight, and though no one else could feel it, Robert Hayes was no longer entirely in that room. The judge pulled his hand back with a scoff, oblivious, already turning to assert control once more, but in the third row, a young prosecutor named Daniel Carter had gone still, his eyes locked on the medal, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something sharper, something urgent, as if a memory had surfaced where none should have been. He leaned forward slightly, heart beginning to pound, because something about that worn ribbon, that dull piece of metal, didn't fit the judge's narrative at all, and for the first time since the gavel had fallen, the balance in the room had begun to tilt, quietly, invisibly, but undeniably. Daniel Carter did not realize he was standing until the chair behind him scraped softly against the polished floor, the sound small but sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence that had settled over the courtroom. His eyes remained fixed on the medal as if it might disappear if he looked away, every detail now clearer, the pale blue ribbon, the subtle pattern woven into it, the way the metal caught the overhead light not with shine but with a quiet, earned presence. His throat tightened. Because he had seen that pattern before, not in person, not up close like this, but in framed photographs and textbooks, in ceremonies broadcast across the country, in stories his father used to tell late at night when the house was quiet and the past felt closer than the present. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice, but the words stayed trapped somewhere between disbelief and urgency. The judge's voice cut back in, sharper now, reclaiming the room with irritation. "Mr. Hayes, I will not tolerate this kind of defiance," Whitmore said, turning away from the old man as if the matter was already decided, as if authority alone could erase whatever doubt had begun to surface. "Bailiff, if he refuses to comply, you will escort him out." The bailiff hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking between the judge and the man in the wheelchair, something in Robert Hayes's stillness made the command feel heavier than it should have been, but training took over and he stepped forward, careful, measured, unsure of why his own hands felt suddenly unsteady. Daniel felt it then, the moment slipping away, the quiet imbalance about to be forced back into order. And he could not let that happen, not without knowing for certain. He turned sharply. Reaching into his jacket pocket, fingers brushing against his phone, his pulse now loud in his ears, he moved toward the side aisle, away from the center of attention, his steps quick but controlled, as if urgency itself might draw unwanted eyes. He dialed a number he had not used in years, one he had memorized out of habit rather than need. It rang once, twice, and then a voice answered, calm, professional, familiar. "Colonel Hayes," the voice said, and Daniel exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Sir, this is Daniel Carter," he said, his voice low, careful not to carry. "I apologize for calling without notice, but I need you to confirm something." There was a pause on the other end, not long, but enough to signal attention. "Go ahead," the colonel replied. Daniel glanced back toward the courtroom floor, where the scene remained frozen in tension, the judge standing rigid, the bailiff approaching, and Robert Hayes unmoving, as if none of it could touch him. "There is a man here," Daniel continued, his voice tightening, "name Robert Hayes, early 80s, wheelchair, he is wearing a medal, I believe it is the Medal of Honor." The silence on the line shifted. "Deepened, repeat the name," the colonel said, no longer casual. Daniel did, slower this time, each word deliberate. "Robert Hayes." Another pause, longer now, heavy with something Daniel could not yet define. When the voice returned, it carried none of its earlier calm. "Do not let anything happen," the colonel said, each word precise, controlled. "Stay where you are, I am making a call." The line went dead, and Daniel stood there for a second, staring at the phone in his hand, the weight of what he had just set in motion settling over him. Behind him, the judge's voice rose again, sharper, louder, trying to force resolution, but something had already changed, something unseen, moving far beyond that room, and for the first time, Daniel understood that the man everyone had been treating as an interruption was, in fact, the center of something much larger than any of them had realized. The bailiff's steps slowed as he approached, not out of hesitation he could explain, but because something in the air had shifted in a way that made each movement feel heavier than the last. His hand hovered just inches from the wheelchair before he spoke, his voice lower now, almost careful. "Sir, I need you to come with me." But Robert Hayes did not move, did not even acknowledge the request, his hand still resting over the medal as if anchoring himself to something far beyond the courtroom walls. Judge Whitmore exhaled sharply, frustration now edging into visible anger. "This is exactly the kind of disruption I will not tolerate," he said, turning back toward the bench but not yet retreating to it, as though proximity itself might enforce compliance. "We are done entertaining this." His gaze swept the room, daring anyone to challenge him, but the room did not respond the way it had before. The earlier murmurs had faded into a dense, uneasy silence, the kind that did not come from obedience but from uncertainty, from the sense that something unseen was unfolding just out of reach. Daniel Carter stepped back into place along the aisle, his phone still in his hand, his heart beating hard enough that he could feel it in his fingertips. He watched the judge, watched the bailiff, but most of all he watched Robert Hayes, trying to reconcile the quiet man in the wheelchair with the weight now pressing down on the room, because the colonel's voice still echoed in his mind, not a suggestion, not a question, but an order. "Do not let anything happen." The words had carried a gravity that Daniel had never heard before, not even in the stories his father used to tell about chain of command and decisions that moved faster than anyone could see. And now, standing here, he realized those decisions were already in motion, far beyond this building, far beyond this city. Judge Whitmore raised the gavel again, the sharp crack of wood against wood cutting through the silence like a final attempt to reclaim control. "Bailiff, escort him out now." The command landed harder this time, leaving no room for interpretation. The bailiff nodded, though his movements remained cautious, almost reluctant. He reached forward again, closer now, his shadow falling across Robert Hayes, and for the first time, Robert lifted his eyes, not toward the judge, not toward the crowd, but toward the man standing over him. The look was not defiant, not angry, it was steady, calm in a way that did not invite confrontation but made it feel unnecessary. The bailiff hesitated, just long enough for it to be noticed, just long enough for the room to feel it, and in that fraction of a second, a sound broke through the tension. Faint at first, distant, the low hum of something outside the courtroom, something mechanical, something approaching. It was easy to miss, easy to dismiss as background noise, But it grew, subtly, steadily, until it pressed against the edges of awareness. A few heads turned toward the tall windows along the side of the room, though nothing could be seen beyond the glare of midday light. Judge Whitmore did not notice, or chose not to, his focus locked on the moment in front of him, determined to end it before anything else could interfere. But Daniel felt it, the shift, the timing, the way the colonel had ended the call without explanation, the way urgency had replaced calm, and now this, the growing presence outside, not chaotic, not loud, but purposeful, precise. Like something arriving exactly when it was meant to, the courtroom remained frozen between action and interruption, the bailiff's hand still suspended, the judge mid-command, the audience caught between curiosity and unease, and Robert Hayes sat at the center of it all, unchanged, unmoved, as if he had been here before, as if he already knew how this would end. The sound grew clearer now, no longer a distant hum but a controlled, rhythmic presence pressing against the edges of the courthouse like a reminder that something larger had entered the moment, a low mechanical thrum that did not belong to traffic or passing noise. It carried weight, intention, and it pulled attention whether anyone wanted to acknowledge it or not. Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats, their eyes drifting toward the tall windows again, trying to make sense of what they could not yet see. The bailiff felt it too, the subtle vibration underfoot, the way the air itself seemed to tighten. His hand remained suspended near Robert Hayes's shoulder, but the certainty behind the judge's order was no longer mirrored in his movement. Judge Whitmore finally noticed the distraction, his expression tightening as he turned slightly toward the windows, irritation flashing across his face. "What is that noise?" he demanded, though no one answered, because no one knew. Daniel Carter did not look toward the windows, he did not need to, his focus remained on Robert Hayes, but his mind was already connecting the sequence, the call, the urgency, the timing, and now this arrival that felt too precise to be coincidence. The hum outside steadied, then settled into a quiet persistence, no longer growing, just present, as if whatever had arrived had reached its destination. The courtroom doors at the back remained closed, but something about them now felt different, as though they were no longer just an exit but a threshold. The judge exhaled sharply, forcing his attention back to the matter at hand, unwilling to let the moment slip from his control. "We are not pausing for distractions," he said, his voice raised, sharper than before, but it lacked the earlier confidence, as if the room itself was no longer fully his to command. He turned back toward the bailiff. "Finish it." The command landed, but it did not carry the same certainty. The bailiff nodded, though slower this time, his hand finally moving the last inch toward Robert Hayes, and in that instant, Robert's fingers tightened slightly over the metal, not defensively, not in resistance, but with a quiet acknowledgement. As if marking the exact point where past and present intersected, the air seemed to still, the kind of stillness that does not come from silence but from anticipation. And then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a precision that cut through everything else. The courtroom doors opened, not thrown wide, not forced, but pushed with measured control, the hinges barely making a sound, yet every head turned at once, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, a presence that entered before a single word was spoken. Two uniformed officers stepped in first, their posture rigid, their expressions neutral but alert, and behind them, a figure followed, taller, composed, carrying a weight that did not need introduction. The room did not erupt, it did not react with noise, instead it tightened, conversations died mid-thought, movement halted, even the judge's next words caught in his throat, because something about the man who had just entered did not ask for attention, it commanded recognition. Daniel felt it immediately, the confirmation of what had already begun, the chain of events set in motion now arriving at its inevitable point. The bailiff's hand dropped back to his side without being told, as if the decision had been made for him, and at the center of it all, Robert Hayes did not turn, did not shift, his posture unchanged, his hand still resting over the metal, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. The man who entered did not raise his voice, did not rush, did not demand attention, and yet the entire courtroom seemed to align around him as if drawn by an invisible gravity. His uniform was immaculate, the kind that carried not just rank but history, for stars resting on his shoulders with a quiet authority that needed no explanation. General Thomas Caldwell moved forward with measured steps, each one deliberate, each one echoing softly against the polished floor. The two officers behind him stopped near the doorway, remaining still, but the general continued alone, his eyes scanning the room once, not searching, but confirming. Judge Whitmore straightened instinctively, the reflex immediate and unpracticed, as if his body recognized something his mind had not yet processed. "This is a restricted proceeding," the judge began, his voice attempting to recover its earlier strength, but it faltered halfway through, the words thinning under the weight of the presence now standing before him. General Caldwell did not respond immediately. He did not acknowledge the judge's authority, nor did he challenge it. Instead, his gaze moved past the bench, past the gallery, and settled on the man in the wheelchair at the center of the room, and in that moment, everything else seemed to fall away. Robert Hayes finally shifted, not much, just enough to turn his head slightly. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that no one else in the room could fully understand. Recognition, not of name, not of face, but of something deeper, something carried across decades. The general stopped a few feet away, his posture straight, his expression composed, but there was a subtle change, a tightening around the eyes, a weight in the silence that followed. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control. "General, if you have business here, it will need to be scheduled properly," he said, the formal tone returning, though it lacked conviction. General Caldwell turned his head just enough to acknowledge the voice, his expression unchanged. "There will be no further proceedings," he said, his voice calm, even, but absolute. The words did not rise, they did not need to, they settled into the room with a finality that no one questioned. Judge Whitmore blinked, caught off guard. "I am presiding over this court," he replied, but the statement felt smaller now, diminished, as if it belonged to a different moment, a different balance of power. The general stepped forward one more pace, closing the distance, his attention returning fully to Robert Hayes, and then, without announcement, without ceremony, he raised his hand in a precise, deliberate motion, and offered a salute. It was not rushed, not symbolic, it was exact, practiced, and carried a weight that silenced even the faintest movement in the room. The effect was immediate. Conversation ceased completely, breathing seemed to pause, even the judge remained still. The authority he had held moments ago now suspended in the presence of something older. Something earned. Daniel Carter felt it like a physical shift, the confirmation of everything he had suspected now undeniable. The medal was no longer just an object, it was context, it was history, it was proof. Robert Hayes did not rush to respond, his hand remained over the medal for a moment longer, as if grounding himself, then slowly, deliberately, he lifted it, not high, not exaggerated, but enough to return the gesture with the same quiet precision. And in that exchange, the courtroom changed, not through words, not through argument, but through recognition, the kind that does not ask for permission and does not require explanation. Judge Whitmore stood frozen behind the bench, the gavel still in his hand, but now it felt like an artifact of a moment that had already passed, because the authority in the room no longer belonged to him, and everyone present could feel it. No one spoke after the salute, not because they were unsure what to say, but because the moment itself did not allow interruption. It settled over the courtroom with a weight that made words feel unnecessary, even intrusive. General Caldwell lowered his hand slowly, his posture unchanged, his gaze still fixed on Robert Hayes, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same controlled calm, but now there was something beneath it, something personal. "It has been a long time, sir," he said. The last word deliberate, unmistakable, it moved through the room like a quiet shockwave, because it reframed everything, not as an encounter between authority and defiance, but between two men connected by something far older than the proceedings that had just been halted. Robert Hayes gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, his expression unchanged, but his eyes held that same depth, that same distant horizon that had been there from the beginning. "Long enough," he replied, his voice steady, neither warm nor cold, simply certain. Judge Whitmore shifted behind the bench, the sound of his shoes against the wood floor louder now in the silence, as if he were trying to re-establish presence through movement alone. "General," he said again, more carefully this time, "this court operates under civil jurisdiction. I will need clarification on your authority to intervene." The question was measured, formal, but it no longer carried the edge it once had. It sounded like procedure, not command. General Caldwell turned slightly, acknowledging the judge fully for the first time, his expression composed, but his eyes sharp, assessing. "The clarification is simple," he said. "You are attempting to compel a recipient of the nation's highest military honor to remove it under threat of penalty." He paused, letting the word settle, not as accusation, but as fact, that action is not appropriate. The judge opened his mouth to respond, but the general continued before he could, not louder, not more forceful, but with a precision that left no room for interruption. There are protocols, there is precedent, and there is respect, he said, each word placed carefully. All three have been overlooked. The courtroom remained still, every person present now aware that what had begun as a minor proceeding had shifted into something far more significant, something that extended beyond local authority, beyond the walls of the building itself. Daniel Carter watched from the aisle, his earlier urgency replaced by a quiet certainty. The call he had made was no longer just a reaction, it had become a turning point, and now he could see the full scope of it unfolding. Judge Whitmore's grip tightened slightly on the gavel. Though he did not raise it, "I was maintaining order," he said, but... The statement sounded defensive now, stripped of its earlier confidence. General Caldwell did not challenge him directly. Instead, he turned his attention back to Robert Hayes, and in that simple shift, the hierarchy in the room became unmistakable. "Sir," the general said, his tone softer now, but no less controlled, "you will not be required to remove that medal today." The words were not framed as permission, but as assurance, as a correction already in effect. Robert Hayes inclined his head once more, a small acknowledgement, nothing more, and yet it carried the weight of acceptance, not of the situation, but of the restoration of something that had been momentarily threatened. Around them, the courtroom seemed to release a breath it had been holding, the tension easing just enough for people to shift in their seats, to glance at one another, to begin processing what they had just witnessed. But no one spoke, because the moment still belonged to something larger than commentary, something quieter, something that did not need to be explained to be understood. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, slowly, like a tide pulling back, revealing something that had been there all along but unnoticed. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of argument or authority, it felt like a space where something had been corrected, something quietly restored. General Caldwell remained where he stood, not asserting further control, not escalating. His presence alone now enough to hold the room in place. His eyes moved briefly across the gallery, taking in the faces, the uncertainty, the realization settling into each person in a different way, some with quiet respect, others with lingering confusion, but none untouched. Daniel Carter lowered his phone at last, his grip relaxing as the tension in his chest eased, the urgency that had driven him moments ago now replaced by a steady awareness that he had witnessed something far beyond a simple legal proceeding, something that would not be recorded in transcripts the way it had truly happened. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat again, but this time there was no sharpness, no edge, only the faint echo of authority trying to find its footing in a room that had already moved on. "This court will take a brief recess," he said, the words formal, procedural, but softer now, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who had not just been confronted with the limits of his own reach. He set the gavel down without striking it, a small action, but one that carried more meaning than any order he had given that day. The bailiff stepped back fully, creating space around Robert Hayes, no longer an enforcer of instruction, but simply a presence maintaining order in a different sense, the kind that did not require force. General Caldwell shifted his stance slightly, the rigid precision of his posture easing just enough to suggest the moment had passed its peak, but his attention remained on Robert. "They should not have put you through this," he said, his voice lower now, meant only for the man before him, but the quiet carried, it always did. Robert Hayes shook his head once, slowly, dismissing the weight of the situation as if it were something far less significant than it appeared. "It is not the first time someone has misunderstood," he replied, his tone even, almost reflective, not bitter, not resentful. Simply stating a truth that had likely followed him for decades. The general's expression tightened slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition, as if he understood exactly what that kind of misunderstanding looked like, not just today, but over a lifetime. Around them, people began to shift more freely, some standing, some whispering quietly, though the volume never rose beyond a respectful murmur. No one rushed toward the exit, no one pushed forward for a closer look. It was as if the room itself understood that this moment did not belong to spectacle, it belonged to something quieter, something earned. Daniel took a step back toward his seat, his eyes still on Robert Hayes, seeing him now not as an old man caught in the wrong place, but as someone who had carried something unseen into the room and let it reveal itself without ever needing to explain. The medal rested once more against Robert's chest, unchanged, unremoved, but now understood in a way it had not been before. Not as decoration, not as sentiment, but as a marker of something that could not be reduced to rules or procedure, and in that understanding, the entire room had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently, because some moments do not end with a verdict, they end with recognition, and once that happens, nothing returns to what it was before. The recess did not dissolve the moment, it only gave it room to breathe. People rose slowly from their seats, not with the usual rush of relief but with a careful awareness that something significant had just taken place. Conversations began in low tones, restrained, as if raising their voices would somehow diminish what they had witnessed. General Caldwell stepped slightly to the side of Robert Hayes, not as a superior positioning himself above, but as someone choosing to stand beside. His posture relaxed now, though the authority he carried had not lessened, it had simply settled into the background where it belonged. "Transportation is outside," he said quietly, his voice meant for Robert alone. "We can take you wherever you need to go." Robert Hayes shook his head faintly, his eyes drifting toward the high windows where sunlight filtered through, steady and unchanged. "I came here on my own," he replied. "I will leave the same way." There was no defiance in the words, only preference, a simple statement of independence that seemed to carry more weight than refusal. The general studied him for a moment, then nodded once, accepting without question, because he understood that some men did not need assistance, only acknowledgement. Daniel Carter remained near the aisle, watching the exchange with a quiet intensity. He felt the urge to step forward, to say something, to apologize perhaps for the situation that had unfolded, but the words never formed, because nothing he could say would match the scale of what had already been resolved. Instead he stayed where he was, bearing witness. The bailiff moved toward the side of the room, speaking quietly into a radio, his tone different now, no longer commanding but coordinating, the structure of the courtroom shifting back into place around a new center. Judge Whitmore had not left the bench, though he no longer stood behind it in the same way. He looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence, as if the role he occupied had been adjusted by something he could not control. He watched the general, then Robert Hayes, his expression no longer sharp, but searching, uncertain, as though trying to reconcile authority with something he had not been trained to measure. Finally, he stepped down from the bench, the movement slow, deliberate, the room noticing even though no one spoke. He approached, not too close, stopping at a respectful distance that had not existed before. "Mr. Hayes," he said. The title deliberate, careful. "This court recognizes that an error was made." The words were formal, but there was something beneath them, something unpracticed, something closer to sincerity than obligation. Robert Hayes turned his head slightly, meeting the judge's gaze without hostility, without satisfaction, simply acknowledging the statement as it was given. "It happens," he said, his voice even, not dismissive, not forgiving, just true. The simplicity of the response seemed to settle something in the room, removing the need for further explanation. The judge gave a small nod, stepping back, not retreating, but yielding space. General Caldwell watched the exchange without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was a quiet approval in the way he remained still, allowing the moment to resolve itself without force. Outside, the low mechanical hum had faded, whatever had arrived had done its part and now receded, leaving behind only the echo of its presence. Inside, the courtroom felt different, not because anything physical had changed, but because everyone in it now carried the same understanding, that authority could be challenged without conflict, that respect could be restored without demand, and that some things, once recognized, did not need to be proven again. Robert Hayes adjusted his hand slightly over the metal, not to display it, not to hide it, but simply to rest, as if the weight it carried had settled back into its rightful place. And for the first time since the gavel had fallen, the room felt still in a way that was not tense, but complete. The courtroom did not return to what it had been, even as people slowly began to move with more confidence, gathering their belongings, exchanging quiet words, stepping back into the rhythm of ordinary life, because something subtle had shifted in each of them, something that would not fully settle until much later. General Caldwell remained beside Robert Hayes for a moment longer, not speaking, not directing, simply present, and then he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect that carried no rank, no command, only acknowledgement. "Take care of yourself, sir," he said quietly. Robert gave a small nod in return, the kind that did not linger, because men like him understood that respect did not need to be repeated, it simply existed. The general turned then, his steps measured as he made his way back toward the doors, the two officers falling in behind him without a word, the room parting naturally to give him space, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, and just as quietly as he had entered, he was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt complete rather than empty. Daniel Carter watched him go, then looked back at Robert Hayes. The distance between them now filled with a quiet understanding. He hesitated, then stepped forward, stopping just short of the wheelchair. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but respectful, "I just wanted to say, thank you." The words felt small, but they were the only ones that felt true. Robert looked up at him, studying his face for a brief moment, then gave a faint, almost amused nod. "For what?" he asked, not dismissively, but with genuine curiosity. Daniel paused, searching for something more precise, but nothing came, so he answered simply, "For being here." Robert's expression softened just enough to be noticed, not a smile, but something close to it. "We all are," he replied, and the words lingered longer than they should have, because they meant more than the moment itself. Daniel stepped back, understanding that the conversation had already reached its natural end. The bailiff moved to assist with clearing the space, but stopped short of offering help, instead holding the door open as Robert turned the wheels of his chair with slow, practiced movements, heading toward the exit on his own terms. The judge watched from a distance, his posture no longer rigid, his hands resting at his sides, as if he had set something down that he would not pick up the same way again. Robert passed by him without pause, without acknowledgement, not out of disregard, but because nothing more needed to be said, and for the first time that day, Judge Whitmore did not call after him, did not assert control. He simply watched, absorbing the quiet finality of the moment. Outside, the sunlight was steady, the air calm, the earlier presence gone without leaving a trace. Robert Hayes paused just beyond the courthouse steps, adjusting his hand briefly over the metal, not checking it, not displaying it, just feeling its place. Then he moved forward, disappearing into the ordinary flow of the street, unnoticed by most, just another man in a worn suit moving through an afternoon like any other. But those who had been inside would carry something different with them, something that could not be written into records or filed away in documents, because it was not about what had been said or ordered. It was about what had been revealed, quietly, without force, without demand. That respect is not something granted by position, and it is not something removed by authority. It is something lived, carried, and remembered, long after the room has emptied and the voices have faded.